Nikolai Gogol, one of the most famous Russian writers. He was born as a Ukrainian, Mykola Hohol. From an early age, Gogol lived on the border of two worlds, peasant and republican Ukraine and imperial Russia. From a young age, Gogol was immersed in Ukrainian folk tradition. The village, the vast Ukrainian steppe, customs, and the daily life of Ukrainian peasants shaped his imagination and later his work. His first stories, full of humor, satire, but also sadness, are imbued with motifs from Ukrainian mythology, folk beliefs, and the characteristic rural life. However, as he grew older, Gogol increasingly felt the attraction of St. Petersburg, the center of intellectual and political life of the then Russian Empire. The Russian language, culture, and high society offered him opportunities that Ukraine could hardly provide. Gogol felt that God had given him two souls, one Ukrainian, the other Russian. In one letter, he wrote how these two souls complemented each other within him, a statement that reflects the state of mind of many Ukrainians at that time. For Gogol, the Russian language was not just a means of communication, but also a channel for spreading his own thoughts, ideas, and Ukrainian themes to a wider audience. Paradoxically, this contributed to the popularization of Ukrainian culture and sensibility among Russians, while at the same time creating confusion about his own national identity. Gogol's novel Taras Bulba best reflects this tension. The first version of the novel, created in 1835, celebrates the freedom-loving spirit of the Ukrainian Cossacks, portraying them as brave fighters for republican ideals. However, under Russian pressure, Gogol published a revised edition of the novel in which the Ukrainian Cossacks are presented as Russians. This amendment reflects the broader political climate of Gogol's time. The Russian Empire was systematically implementing a policy of centralization and Russification of its peripheral regions, including Ukraine. Ukraine was increasingly losing its status as a historical land with its own identity and was being reduced to Little Russia, a region whose population was officially described by Moscow as related or even identical to the Russian one. Ukrainians, from the perspective of official circles, were kokoli, peasant gourds, uneducated and capable only of war and farming. Despite Moscow's imperial ambitions, the Ukrainian identity endures, although often concealed and suppressed. Official measures, such as the ban on the Ukrainian language in education and the refusal to establish schools in the Ukrainian language, have not succeeded in completely erasing the national consciousness. In Gogol's time, many Ukrainians temporarily accepted the Russian imperial identity as a way to gain social prestige and power, but they retained a deep Ukrainian national and state consciousness. Gogol's literature, although written in Russian, remains imbued with Ukrainian motifs. In works such as Evenings on a Farm near Dikanka and Taras Bulba, Gogol describes Ukrainian customs, landscapes, and characters with irony and affection. Additionally, he mocked Russian bureaucracy, submissive flattery, and conformism. It was precisely this Cossack disdain for authority that made him globally recognizable. People around the world easily identify with his satire of power. Gogol has thus, paradoxically, become a symbol of Russian literature that promotes naturalism, concern for ordinary people, and openness to Ukrainian culture. His use of Ukrainianisms in the Russian language temporarily brought the two peoples closer together, but it could not erase deep political and cultural differences. Behind Gogol's vision of the merging of peoples stands the ideology of Pan-Slavism, which also influenced other cultural figures, such as Ljudevit Gaj, the creator of the modern Croatian literary language. Despite this, Gogol succumbed in St. Petersburg to the pressure of high society, literary critics, and friends, striving to be as Russian as possible. He began to perceive his Ukrainian identity as a moral decline, something to be ashamed of. The Russian language and culture then seemed like the only true medium for addressing universal themes, so Gogol's Ukrainian past was suppressed, and his national identity became blurred. However, Gogol never completely forgot Ukraine. He planned to write the history of his homeland, seeing the Ukrainian identity as the result of a long struggle against Asian and European powers. Through steppes, plains, battle glory, and a republican spirit, Gogol sought to portray Ukrainians as a people with a warrior's heart, capable of alliances and resistance. Gogol's divided identity, his Russian-Ukrainian dilemma, remains a key component of the political relations between Moscow and Kyiv. Former Russian President Boris Yeltsin highlighted Gogol in '97 as a shared cultural heritage, asserting that Russians and Ukrainians should not allow political trivialities to destroy the friendship between the two peoples. According to Yeltsin, Gogol testifies to the impossibility of dividing historical heritage because, according to the Russian narrative, Ukrainians and Russians are Siamese twins whose fate is inseparable. Behind these touching words, however, lie the imperial ambitions of official Moscow, which recognized Ukraine only after long negotiations and for a limited period. A large number of Russians believe that historical ties with the Ukraine cannot be broken, and that an imperial vision of cooperation and friendship must prevail. This ideology also underlies the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which part of Russian society considers a justified self-defense against Western influence and Ukrainian nationalism. These words are spoken today by Russian President Vladimir Putin, who calls Ukrainians fascists and thereby justifies his imperial aggression. Therefore, it should be said that Gogol is a Ukrainian whom Russian imperialism stole from his country. We must be aware of these facts because the Russian imperial theft took place in front of Europe. Because of this theft, many Croats still do not know that Ukraine is a separate country with its own distinct history.